Two guys either side of 50 with one dream to achieve middle-aged sporting glory. This is the Missing Links Golf Show. Andy Walker, welcome back to the Missing Links Golf Show. How good is it?
It is pretty wonderful, to be honest with you. I'm always keen to talk about golf and all things golf, and we've got I think, a really exciting episode for us this week. I'm really looking forward to hearing about a particular experience that you've had recently.
Yes, it's quite an exciting one. So we've got a friend of the show, Jason Butt, is going to be joining us because not that long ago, a few weeks ago, but not that long ago, I caught up with Jason. I've kind of alluded to this in some of the previous episodes, but I caught up with Jace to do a wedge fitting, which was an awesome experience for an hour or so, hitting wide variety of Vokey SM10s. Just trying all the different lofts, all the different bounces, all the different grinds, all the different combinations. There's so many different things that go into figuring out what wedge is right for you. And it was a massively eye-opening experience. I mean, I know we talked to Jason before about your top end of the bag fitting.
Yeah.
This one, I think, was probably quite different, but there's definitely no shortage of technical input into getting the right wedge set up in your bag.
Yeah, and just all the different variances of bounces and grinds, and you as an individual player, how your club interacts with the turf, whether you're coming into it or steeply, or you've got more of a shallow attack angle. It's all different variances to what the setup of your wedge should be. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how you went and what Jason had to say and what the end result was.
Well, probably a good thing to do then is to get him on the show and bring him into the call so that we can actually hear all about it rather than me just talking about him talking about it. Let's get him to actually talk about it.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, let's do it. Well, it is a very big welcome back to return guest to the Missing Links Golf Show. I think it's fair to say friend of the show, Jason Butt. Welcome back, Jace.
Thank you, mate. Thanks for having me again. Yeah, good to be back on again for round two.
Oh, it's good to see you. You're now intimately aware of the games of both myself and Andy Walker, having had the joy of fitting opposite ends of the bag for both of us. But yeah, I mean, today we're here to talk about wedges, I guess, is the topic of the day.
Cool. Yeah, we obviously spent some time not long back and went through the process. So yeah, it'd be good to take a deep dive and obviously fire away with some questions.
Yeah, so for the Pilgrim's benefit, how long ago was it now? It was probably a month ago, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I would say
a month ago, something like that.
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah.
4 to 6 weeks ago, I had the joy of spending an hour or so with Jason on the practice fairway at Royal Dubbo, going through the range of Vokey wedges. Far out, what an experience that was. I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. So thank you for that. It's a little bit like Christmas when you're just getting to play with every, loft, bounce, grind combination thereof for the morning to see what works. Andy Walker, something I think you would enjoy as well at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is something that I am going to go through at some point. And it's interesting. I'll get, Jason, I'll get your opinion on this as we go in. But for mine, I think I need to wait until I change my irons over so we can get the gapping right. Because from where I am with the AP2s, the gapping that I've got in the two Vokeys I have is quite good. I've got a 50, 54, 58 with my wedges, so that's a pretty good sort of gapping from my perspective. But then probably going to go, I think, with the T150s. They seem to sort of fit what I think is would suit me, and that then changes the lofts and changes the gapping. So I think I probably need to do both at the same time, because that's a pretty important part of, I guess, wedge fitting, isn't it? With to make sure those gaps are right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, with players swinging wedges at different speeds or every club at different speeds, 4 to 6 degrees of loft separation is kind of the gold standard, what we look for in terms of loft. But obviously, players at higher speeds, 6 degrees can become 20 plus meters of distance between wedges, which is the scoring part of the bag. So, isn't the ideal scenario. So, yeah, definitely figuring out, okay, well, how far does your wedge go, whether it's a T100, T150, T200, whatever that may be. Figuring out, yeah, what gap works for you in that space. That's why I think there's a lot of 48-degree gap wedges getting around nowadays, because of a lot of players preferring T150 or 200 in that mold, and the lofts are stronger. So, yeah, figuring the gapping out as a part of the process. And yeah, once you figure out which iron model you want to work into, which I think you're doing the right thing there to hold off before you go ahead and get wedges. I mean, unless you've got something that's a lob wedge in SM4 or something like that, and it's absolutely beaten up, you're probably
No.
like, hey, you're losing out here with waiting 12 months. You probably need to look at changing a lob wedge. But yeah, if you're looking at irons as well, I would try to do them all together. That's a very sensible thing to do.
Mm, mm. And look, just before we get into Steve's fitting, I'd like to have a bit of an understanding of what your opinion on Steve's previous wedges and the condition that they were in.
Look, fair to say he got a pretty nice upgrade with SM10. Yeah,
Understatement of the year, maybe.
yeah. No, his wedges were pretty shot. I was pretty confident we were going to
Yep.
get him into something a little better than what he had. That's for sure.
I think it's no surprise to anyone that's seen those wedges to hear that I have had some struggles with short game recently.
Always interesting when you see a player that turns up with wedges that are super old, just saying, "Oh yeah, I've just been really struggling. These aren't working, whatever it may be." And you just look at their grooves and you go, "Man, they are absolutely shot. You need new grooves. It doesn't matter how well your wedges are fitted with your grinds and lofts. If your grooves are cooked, there, yeah, it doesn't matter what you do. At the end of the day, grooves wear out, and you need to change them over a period of time. So yeah, no, Steve, you're one that's pretty confident your wedges are going to be better."
So it's funny you say that, because after now I've had I don't know, probably 4 or 5 rounds with the SM10s. I've discovered this amazing phenomenon. It's called spin.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
quite amazing.
life changing.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. Oh dear. So no, that is pretty funny. But I think, look, before we get into the nitty gritty of what went on the day, I'm curious, if someone's coming for a wedge fitting, maybe just broadly speaking, what can they expect? What's the sort of process? Because it was quite clear to me that you've actually got quite a process to work through, with certain methods and a bit of a structure to the session. So what would
Yeah.
they expect?
Yeah, I mean, well, ideal world we'll be doing wedge fitting off turf. Just I think that's the best case scenario with any wedge fitting, which is what we had the luxury of doing, Steve, because you can see it, feel it through the turf. Don't get me wrong, you can do it off mats and you'll still get an idea of where the strike location is, which is really important on a wedge. But I guess our process is going through what we would call a blind test, and we typically do that from starting at the green, working back, or if we don't have a green to hit towards, we can start with the wedge and work our way through to lob wedge. But it's a matter of figuring out, okay, well, what's your pitching wedge loft? What's your current loft separation? Does that work? Figuring out what you do with those particular clubs and how you use them. Once we kind of ask those base questions of course condition, the way you like to use your wedges. Some people like to chip with their lob wedge. Some people a sand wedge. Some people chip with their gap wedge. Not very common, but some people do. And I guess from there, we're like, okay, well, if we know that a 58-degree wedge for like yourself, Andy, might be the most common lob or the most lofted wedge that you like to use. Great, let's start around the greens. And I'll, as you would have seen, Steve, hand you the grip and won't show you the actual grind or bounce on that particular club, and we'll just hit shots the way that you typically will on the golf course, whether it's with an open face, pretty square, and figure out, okay, like around the greens, how would you typically use this club? And I'll watch 3 to 5 shots with each grind, and I'll get every player as best as I can with a time frame to hit each grind. And then it's like, okay, you'll understand that there's a reason why there's a 14-degree K grind and a 4-degree T grind, because there's everything in between that with how players want to use particular clubs. And I'll get players to hit each grind and just go through a process of elimination and figure out, okay, well, with how you deliver the club, with how you want to use the club, what's going to work best. And a lot of the times it's pretty clear cut. Sometimes you'll get a really skilled player and they'll make 3 or 4 work well, but that's when it comes down to, okay, well, we probably need to explore it a little deeper and go, okay, well, we need to hit a lot of different shots to get an understanding that one will work better than the other. But yeah, typically the process is that blind testing and figuring out, okay, well, without you being biased towards any particular thing, let's hit these. Hey, if you wanted to get a maybe 4-degree T grind, great, but let's test it first and see if it works.
Yeah, I mean, I quite enjoyed the blind test element, and Andy Walker, you'll enjoy this. So we were going through a few different wedges at the time, sand wedges, I think 56 degrees anyway. Jason handed me one, handed me another one, and sort of said, "Can you tell the difference? Can you feel what's different between those two?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, I think this one's got a bit more bounce. Is that right?" And he just simply looked at me and went, "No."
Nice.
I remember
Nice.
by the end of our fitting, Steve, it's pretty clear cut. It was the 56, I think we were hitting, that it was kind of, we were figuring out that the high bounce option was like, okay, you've hit this enough times now to know this is the right option. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it was the 14-degree bounce F grind, I think it was. So actually, that's probably a good place to go, like just for the pilgrims. I think we all understand what loft means. The degree of how open that club face is to the sky. Higher the number, higher the loft. But in terms of bounce and grind, in layman's terms, how do you explain what those terms mean?
Okay, well, grind is the soul of the wedge. Grind is basically, so to start, like you say, layman's terms, think of, you've got a F grind, which is the court standard. It's a wide sole, and other grinds came about because there would be people that would request a different wedge, and they would actually get thrown on a grinder, and you would take away a part of the sole of the wedge. So, layman's terms, you got a full sole, which is an F grind, and you've got we would call an M grind, which has the back part of the wedge taken away and the heel and the toe. The advantage of an M grind is when you open the face, the leading edge of the wedge doesn't sit off the ground. When you open the face with an F grind, the leading edge will sit a little higher. Both have positives and negatives about what they do. So there's not really one that's right or wrong, but that's kind of the difference between the grinds. The grind is the soul of the wedge, and how they sit is the biggest thing between what they do. Bounce is, how do I explain bounce in layman's terms? Basically, the higher the bounce angle is, well, if you're a player that takes big divots, you need bounce. If you're a player that picks it off the turf, low bounce typically works better, is probably the easiest way to explain it. It's the angle when you sit a wedge on the ground between the leading edge and the trailing edge when it's sitting flush on the ground. And that's really difficult to explain on a Zoom call. It's probably easier to explain in a fitting environment. But that's basically what bounce and grind is. I would say that I very rarely talk to bounce the actual number all that often. Sometimes I do, depending on the player, but I mean, often the times it's like, hey, like with how you want to use the club, an M grind might work really well. It depends on each player, but that's kind of the rough bounce and grind and what they mean.
So my understanding, Jason, is that if you've got softer turf, something with more bounce is beneficial, and on like a hard pan, like, whether it be a links course or if you're on really tightly mown couch, then less bounce is an advantage. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's like definitely accurate in the sense of what it is. But I think the way I explain it to people is that your delivery is probably the number one key thing to look at, because if you're got a steep angle of attack on soft turf, and you're probably going to have a steep angle of attack on firm turf. Um,
Hmm.
so, like, it's yes, it is correct. You're dead right in that typically the Melbourne Sandbelt would sell a lot more low bounce lob wedges than what we would say in Sydney or Queensland. Um, but it's definitely one of those ones that, hey, even if you're playing on really firm, hard surfaces, if you're getting steep and taking turf, you're probably going to need some element of bounce in that way. But you're right. Typically, firmer turf conditions, lower the bounce. Softer turf, it's a little more just to help get the wedge through the turf.
And how does that react to bunkers as well? Because obviously there's a different interaction between the club and sand versus the club and turf. So does that change the game?
Same principle in that yeah, when it's firmer or there's not much sand, a less bounce option works well. Same thing. This isn't a one size fits all, but sometimes when you have two different grinds, that can work well in that aspect, because you've got a sand wedge a little bit more bounce and a lob wedge with a little bit less. You've kind of got more options around the green. So when you do get that condition that's a little firmer out of a bunker, for example, you can kind of lean on one more than the other. Like I said, that's not a one size fits all thing, but that can be an advantage if you do that. Um, yeah, it is the same principle though. I mean, I play my golf at Magenta Shores on the Central Coast, and I carry a 14-degree K grind, and its sole use is in the bunkers. Um, there is beach sand there, and there's a lot of them. So
Hmm.
a lot of the times you're in there and you need something to help you get out of them. So for me, I chip a lot with my 54-degree wedge because there's less bounce on it, and I like to use that more around the greens for me personally. But I know that if I use something with low bounce in a bunker around there, it's really challenging. So I have that club specifically for that reason.
Because I have played Magenta a number of times, and those bunkers, there's a lot of sand in them,
Yeah.
and a low bounce club would just dig straight in. You wouldn't get that nice sort of pick through the sand that you'd need.
Absolutely, yeah. And I play there every Saturday, so it's kind of why I have my wedges set up that way. And exactly like you said, I've had an M grind in there, which is what I had before I went to my K, and it was brutal. I made a lot of doubles.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you're right. Like typically, you've got to try to understand the golfer, and the reality is you kind of don't want to be too narrow minded with, I guess, where you go with grinds. But I mean, yeah, typically speaking, if you ask the right questions at the start of the fitting, I reckon the first 5 minutes with that interview with the golfer of trying to get an understanding of what they do, it's obviously going to be a little difficult if they're like, hey, I play golf at here, and here, and they're all completely different. It's like, well,
Mm. Yep.
that becomes a little bit of a challenge. That's where maybe that dual setup can work better. So they have more options. But yeah, the process of figuring out how heavy the sand is the same sort of principle, like you said, Andy, with turf.
It's interesting that you're talking about having the wrong amount of bounce or the wrong grind or the wrong combination, even for a golfer of your level at Magenta, that's going to lead to doubles. So that kind of makes me think, for the average golfer out there that's buying their wedges, off the shelf or off Golf Clearance Outlet or Golf Box or any of the, highly reputable online um, outlets that exist, but with absolutely no thought, knowledge, or understanding of whether or not they're buying, like what bounce or grind that they're buying with these wedges. How big an impact does having ill fitting and ill thought through wedge combinations in your bag have for the average golfer? Is this the sort of thing that's going to save them multiple shots around?
It can do. I've seen some pretty poorly used grinds and bounce options for players that have turned up to the fitting tee, and I've just been like, this is not right for you. You should not be using this. Often it's the extremes when you get that person that's using a really low bounce option or a really high bounce option, and they kind of need something on the other end of the spectrum. That's where it's like you are really going to notice a benefit here in changing the setup. The most common thing that I see every day on the fitting tee, I saw it today, like we were chatting earlier on. I was at East Lakes Golf Club fitting today, and you see it where just grooves. People have grooves that are really, really old, and that would be the biggest scoring potential, I would say, for people that turn up. PGA Tour players are very fortunate that they change their wedges as often as they do because they get given them. But after 75 rounds of golf, you're going to start to see a deterioration of sort of launch and spin. You'll see basically when a groove wears out, the golf ball can't grip to the face. When the ball can't grip to the face, it rolls up. And two things happen when that happens. The launch of the golf ball will go up and the spin will come down. And when those two things happen, controlling distance and trajectory is really difficult. If you watch the PGA Tour each week, you'll watch how low the ball flies with a wedge and how much the ball spins. So those two combinations with groove wear would probably be the biggest thing I see from a scoring potential with players. But I definitely see that people will turn up with a 4-degree lob wedge in the tee grind. They'll just say, hey, that's not going to work for you.
And I would, just in what you said, I would think that, say someone who, they've wanted to improve their short game, so they've gone out, they've done a fair bit of work over a period of time with their wedges, and they've worn out a particular place in their wedges, that maybe the grooves aren't that good. They'll go out and play, and if they hit a different part of the club, I'm assuming that they're going to have a completely different outcome to what they would if they hit that sort of worn place of the wedge as well. So the inconsistencies, I guess, you would get with your shots in general would be all over the place.
Definitely. Yeah, we have like a bit of a golden rule when we do wedge fitting. It's probably a good one for people listening if they have any kind of launch monitor, where basically a 60-degree wedge should launch at half of the loft minus one. So a 60-degree wedge is 29 degrees of launch. When you start to see that wedge launch higher than that, like 30 plus, I would look at your grooves. See, is there an issue with them? Is it just the way that I'm swinging the club and it's my delivery that's influencing that? But if you're making pretty good contact on them and you're seeing that launch go up, and that's the same with sand wedge as well. So you half the loft minus one, and we kind of look at that as the golden rule for launch with wedges. When you see that start to go up and up and up, it's a really good sign that, hey, maybe it could be a good time to do what Steve did and look at some new grooves and new grinds and see if there's something that can be better, because we just know when greens get firm and fast, when the ball comes in high with no spin or launches high with no spin, it's really challenging to control how far the ball goes. And like you said, Andy, it's just the inconsistencies.
That's an interesting formula. I haven't heard that before. Does that carry true for other clubs in the bag as well? That sort of half the loft minus one, or is it solely
just wedges? Just wedges. We would look more at that. I wouldn't say that process is the same for everything with club fitting, but definitely wedges with pitching wedge through the lob. We would kind of try to see that particular sort of launch pattern. And it's just something that we'll look at. Like if we watch sort of the first few shots with their own, and they're just questioning whether they're right or wrong, and you see it to be pretty close, it's like, oh, great, they're obviously got something that's still working really well. But as soon as you start to see that, most players chip most with their lob and sand wedge, so you're going to see those two wear out the quickest. So for anybody that has that launch monitor to jump on there and say, hey, what's my launch doing? If my 60's coming at 35 degrees, could be worthwhile checking it out and seeing if there's something that could be better. Especially if if I see somebody turn up with an SM8 or older wedge, there's a fair chance that their grooves are going to be pretty tired.
Mm. So with loft, do you find that a lot of golfers are using too much loft? Because I find that, say, a 60, for instance, I don't feel I'm good enough, even me playing off three. And maybe that's a reflection of my short game, but I still don't feel like I'm good enough to be able to consistently pitch or chip with a 60 degree, which is why I went for the 54 and 58. I find that the 54 and the 58 are much easier to be able to control around the greens. In fact, I was looking at a YouTube video, YouTube University, and was listening to Tiger Woods talk about his chipping, and he said that he still the vast majority of the time uses a 56 degree a wedge. So for me, if Tiger's using a 56 degree and that's what he's getting the best results with, who am I to be, looking at a 60, with the vast majority of my shots around the green.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. I think it's a little bit to do with, I guess, what you started playing golf with can influence that. Like Tiger would have been 56. That's what he probably grew up playing golf with. And then what I see with players that have too much loft, a lot of the times they try to take the loft away, and that typically leads to inconsistencies. Leading edge gets stuck, and bad things happen. So yeah, it's probably varied by the golfer, but I would say it's not. I mean, 60 is still a really common lob wedge fitting. I think if you have a 58-degree wedge, as long as you can play the shots that you need, as long as you can hit it high enough to land it soft enough in a short-sided position, because that's typically what you're using that club for, then great. I think the advantage with a 58 is definitely when you're hitting more full pitch shots, it's better. And it's better because that launch will be lower because there's less loft there. So there's less static loft at address. And yeah, I think 58, 60, it's player dependent. But I think if you see that golfer that is turning up and using a 60-degree wedge, yeah, definitely, I would say a general rule of thumb, if you're a less skilled golfer or not confident with a wedge, yeah, a sand wedge should or could be a better option for you just to use your default around the greens for sure. I would see that enough times to suggest that to players.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that stood out for me when we did the fitting session was, we kind of think about these things insofar as it's just improving your game. So therefore you think about improving your better shots, becoming better shots. One of the things that stood out was it wasn't necessarily that, but it was about your sort of 50-50 shots, not quite perfect strikes, getting much better outcomes. And that's where you see that performance drop off really steeply with clubs that maybe aren't performing as well or aren't fitted as well. And I noticed that, I don't know if you recall, but when we were kind of towards the end of the session working between really just the two options on the 56-degree wedge, and there was one that, if I didn't strike it perfectly, that performance drop off was quite steep. Whereas the one that I ended up with, when it was a strike that was just maybe a touch heavy or, not quite perfect, it actually still performed quite well. So I thought that was really interesting. It's just creating that bigger window and that bigger safety net to be able to hit a decent shot, not necessarily improving your perfect strikes, but actually just making more of your strikes more acceptable. Is that, I feel like I'm on the path, but
you're nailed it. Yeah. We sort of talk on the fitting tee kind of north, south, east, west with dispersion, and a lot of the times that kind of north, south, so that's kind of like front to back. That's where we see I say call it for you when we were testing grinds. That was something with the sand wedge we were seeing where you had something with a little wider in the sole and a little bit more bounce. That for you on that one that you got a little stuck through the turf, your north to south was better. Your bad one was closer to your good one from a distance because it worked better through the turf. As soon as we went to something, my memory is not overly sharp, but I think it was S grind or whatever it was that we were testing. Yeah,
I don't know because it was blind. You wouldn't tell me.
Yeah, fair. You're a good student. Yeah, the S grind. As soon as you say got a little early, or you just got a little bit stuck, the leading edge
Yeah, it was
dug a
digging in.
little bit, and then that was where you saw the bad ones not be as good. So yeah, your north to south dispersion was pretty noticeable when we were testing those. I remember though we had to do probably spend a little bit more time on there than I guess, well, just for you because we couldn't really figure out the answer straight away. It was kind of like, okay, we need to do further testing to establish what's right. Yeah, by the end of it, we'll both look at each other and we're like, we know the answer now.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus, I was happy that it took a little bit longer because it's quite good fun just hitting wedge shots for an hour in the morning before you go to work. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely. That was good.
The other thing that I noticed in your method of going through a wedge fitting, and I don't know if this was the same, Andy, that you experienced when Jason was doing the top of the bag fitting, but there was a couple of sayings that I noticed that you had that you were just repeatedly saying over and over. And I think from memory, it was something like good swing, and that was pure. Like you just kept saying that all the time when I was hitting balls.
I know. Well, you did mention that you had one over through 10 today, which is pretty tidy.
So I don't know, Andy, was that something that Jace was saying to you with the driver fin?
Depended on which club it was and what shaft was in the bag, because there were a couple that were quite wide that we finally sort of narrowed it down to quite a good dispersion.
That's pretty funny.
So if I can ask then, Steve, what tell us the clubs that you got. So what was the end result?
That is a good point. So SM10s, I ended up with a 48 degree, 52 degree, and a 56. So it was a all in F grind. The 48 was 10 degree of bounce. The 52 was 12 degrees of bounce, and the 56 was 14 degrees of bounce. So it was going up by 2 with each wedge. And you know what? I have actually found that to be very useful just for a couple of different shots around the green. In particular, just having that little bounce variation between the 56 and the 52 around the green for, sort of being able to play some higher shots versus bump and runs with those two different wedges, I thought has actually been quite versatile, which is good. It's got me thinking about a 60 degree lob wedge as well, just because I only carry at this point in time 13 clubs. Whether or not I want to go to a 4 wedge plus pitching wedge setup. Or look.
I do recall that conversation. It was kind of like there's space there, but it wasn't a need to at that point in time. I think with what you had going on. Yeah.
And I'm still not sure, to be perfectly honest, because like Andy, I'm a bit scared of a 60 degree lob wedge. And it's interesting that we both talk about it, but then you talk to other people and, their first reaction is don't be crazy. The 60 degree lob wedge, that's what I use all the time. And, you absolutely need to get one. So I'm not sure at the moment. My jury's out a little bit on that, because I kind of feel like the 56, when it's opened up as well, it can actually get a lot of height. So I'm not convinced.
Yeah, most players, I mean, as long as you are able to create enough height, that can be the right option to carry something in 56 or 58. I mean, a 60, like you would have heard people say, it's really beneficial for the right person. And as long as you're able to play, some people just simply don't need it. Sometimes less is more. And it's not always the case that you need to add something else there. I mean, I've done fittings with typically lower swing speeds where I'll say, hey, look, you need a pitching wedge, which it might be in a T350 at 43 degrees. And hey, a 54 degree sand wedge at this point in time is going to be totally sufficient for you right now. And you don't need any more than that. So sometimes if you go, hey, I've got now this many clubs, it gets almost a little bit, hey, which one do I need to use now?
I think that's true. Yeah.
As opposed to being, hey, like I know that this club works for this particular shot and I've had a lot of success with it. So I'm going to use it. At 60 has its merits, but I remember with you, it was 13 clubs and we were sticking that way for the time being.
Lucky 13. Because I'm not sure, like at the top end of the bag, I've got driver, 5 wood, 4 hybrid, and then 5 through pitching wedge in the iron. So there's probably a bit of a gap in that top end potentially.
I'm
I'm not
surprised you
sure.
don't have a 4-iron in there.
Well, I've got a 4 hybrid, which kind of does that job.
Mm.
So I don't know. I mean, what is interesting as well, we're getting off the topic of wedges, but
Mm.
I didn't feel like I've lost any distance by going from 3 wood to 5 wood. I'm getting a bit more height, and it's definitely easy to launch off the deck when you're playing fairway shots on par fives. But I don't feel like I've lost any distance, which is
Mm.
maybe to do with the technology of the different clubs that I've changed from. But anyway,
Mm.
I digress.
Mm.
I
Okay.
digress.
So, Steve, if I could ask you, and Jason, I'm going to come to you and ask the same question in a tick to see if there's a difference in the answer. What what was it that made you go, yeah, this is the right club for me? Was it the ground interaction with the club? Was it the flight the ball was getting? Was it the spin? Like what was it? Was it a bit of each? Like what was it where you went, yeah, you know what, this is it. This is what I like in this club.
Yeah, good question. So it was with the 52 and the 48, it was more about distance gapping. So the club head and ball speed to make sure that we were getting the right gaps between from pitching wedge up to the 56 degree. We spent a lot of time on the 56 getting that right around the grind and the bounce option, because there weren't really that many combinations to choose from for the 48 degree anyway. If I remember correctly, it was really only one option.
So what was that, your baseline? Was the 56 your baseline that you were looking at, and you're
Not
looking to?
specifically. The baseline was the loft of my existing pitching wedge, which is at 44 degrees in the Callaway Apex. So we started there. We knew what that was delivering in terms of distances. And then it was a case of looking at, all right, well, if we went to a 50 degree as the next gap wedge instead of a 48, and looking at that distance was just too much. That gap was just too much. So the 48 degree was the right gap.
Yep.
And so therefore the 52 was the right gap, and therefore the 56 was the right gap, which is why it didn't end up at a, say a 50, 54, 58 scenario. So that kind of, it was that pitching wedge on my iron set that kind of anchored it, which is a little bit in line with what you're thinking about with your changeover. So that was the gapping conversation. But then really it was about getting the right bounce and grind option with the 56.
Yep.
And to be honest with you, as Jason talked about, we were kind of, moving between two for quite a while. But there was one particular shot, which is what I was alluding to before, when I caught it not perfect. To be honest, there was more than one shot when I caught it not perfect, but this one that was important because it still got a really good result and it still landed on around about the target that I was aiming for. And I knew that feeling of being slightly heavy into the ball with my existing wedges, it would have got about halfway there, right? Like I just would have laid a sod over it and it would have been dreadful. But with this, it still moved through the turf and I got a reasonable result. And a similar swing with the other grind option, it lost performance really quickly. So for me, it was really in that one shot that determined the difference between the two. And that was the performance on the imperfect strike.
Yeah.
That it actually carried it through. So that's where the decision got made.
Okay. So Jason, from a fitter's perspective, from the other side, like what was it when you were watching Steve that you went, yep, that's it, that's the one?
I think it's exactly kind of what Steve said. I know that it was pretty challenging and it took time to figure out what was actually the right option because he was making both work pretty well. And it was definitely to me the sound, even on his good ones, to be honest, were different. And the flight was, since the F grind in the 56 being a little bit more bounce, it struck. We kind of look at grooves 2 to 5 to be the ideal strike location. And on his bad ones, since there's a little bit more bounce, the strike was closer to there. So it flighted a little lower. And with less bounce, since the leading edge sits tighter to the ground, he's one that got a little stuck. It launched kind of probably grooves, I don't know, 6 to 8 higher on the face. And that one that gets a little diggy kind of pops up and just doesn't flight the same.
Mm.
So to me, it was that one that, hey, when he was getting his good ones and his bad ones, his launch windows were really close.
Yep.
As opposed to just being more inconsistent. And that just took time to see that. Like I didn't notice that when we were testing initially, when we kind of saw, okay, these two wedges are kind of the two that are going to work best. Let's kind of figure out if that's going to be the right thing. But I would say, yeah, overall, like his launch windows with that F grind were far more consistent than the S. It was just the variation was a lot tighter. So yeah, therefore his bad ones were better and got closer to his good ones. So that was probably what I noticed.
Mm. I find it really interesting because in the conversations that we'd had in the lead up to the fitting, Steve was sort of a little bit torn between, oh, should I get a putter fitting or should I get a wedge fitting? And we looked at his stats and his strokes gain stats and putting, was actually quite a quite a good stat for him. It was one of the strengths of his game, whereas the short game in the wedges, and he admitted it numerous times that he just didn't have a great deal of confidence in his short game around the greens and with his wedges. And I find it really interesting that a good club fitting and the right wedges, how much difference that makes.
Yeah. Yeah, it can make a huge difference. Yeah, like I said, especially when they turn up as old as what they did with Steve on the fitting tee.
He's talking about the clubs, not the
the
player.
clubs.
Okay.
Yeah, that's sorry. That was what I was referencing. The clubs being as old as what they were when you turned up. Yeah, you know that you're almost immediately going to see a benefit, just because, yeah, like I said, fresh grooves. But yeah, definitely when you start to figure out, okay, well, how do you want to use them? What sort of course conditions do you play with? What grind is that going to lead you toward? And we sort of saw that with the 56. Yeah, it was actually a really cool one because I recall it might have been the last handful of shots that we saw with that F. It was just
It was.
yeah, it was really clear cut. It was like, okay, we are on the money here. So which was cool because it doesn't always work out that way. And when you see it work out that way, it's like you can be really confident that, hey, this is going to be the right wedge for you.
Yeah, it was cool. And Andy, probably worth mentioning one of the processes that Jace had me go through with this to, kind of look at the performance of each of the different clubs and setups was hit a couple of full shots, then hit a couple of, say about 30-meter pitches, and then hit a few sort of lay it open and more flop style shots just to use it in 3 different ways.
Yep.
To see how it would perform through those 3 different styles of shots. I thought, yeah, and I think doing that, you actually really saw how the club would work in different scenarios, and that sort of helped weed a few out along the way that, they were fine on the full shots, but it was more when you're getting into the finesse style shots where, kind of using it in slightly different ways they were really starting to fall over. So that helped whittle a few away as well, which was interesting. So, because
Yeah,
I didn't know what to expect.
I certainly say sometimes that some wedges are a one-trick pony for players, and it might be a really great grind for a one particular shot. But the reality is, with a 56-degree wedge, if that's your most lofted wedge, you needed to do a few things. Like you needed to work in a bunker, you need to use greenside, you need to use for full shots, for pitch shots. So having it as being better at one particular shot is not great because maybe all the other shots aren't as good. Whereas if you get something that's kind of good in the bunkers, good here, good there, it's kind of like, well, I'd be leaning more towards that as opposed to maybe one that's really beneficial elsewhere. And that's kind of what we saw with you when we went through that process of, okay, figuring out, okay, well, what do you want to use this for? And when we tested different things, yeah, we'd definitely be able to. I know we went to those 2 pretty quickly.
Yeah, we did, because the other ones, they were okay on a full swing, but it was, yeah, when you kind of bring the swing speed down a little bit and trying to use your hands through the ball, just the margin for error wasn't there with a lot of the other clubs. Something else that I've actually noticed, and this, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to explain this very well in just audio, but so out of bunkers, and this may come as no surprise looking at what the state of my previous wedges for you, I'd always struggled to get any kind of spin on the ball out of a bunker with that old Cleveland CJ14. But what I've noticed with the SM10 is that the same sort of strike and swing and everything, it's just flying a little bit further on the green for me now out of the sand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just something to kind of recalibrate and get a little bit used to. But the other thing that I'm noticing is that the divot in the bunker is different. And what I mean by that is rather than just the sand looking all kind of just fluffy like you've gone through it, but it actually looks like the bounce of the club on the bottom of the divot's actually compressed the sand on the way through as well. It's just kind of making it smooth rather than churned up. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm noticing a different divot.
I would assume that. So, would you say that it's a good thing or a bad thing that it's happening the way that it is? Like, it's a better reaction.
I think it's good because I think it's more gliding through the sand and less digging.
So it sounds like the bounce is working better, and that sole being a little wider is just being a little bit faster, which is potentially why it's going a little bit further. It's yeah. I mean, I think there's an element there where yeah. I mean, I see it every week at Magenta where if you get something that just gets a little bit stuck or something with low bounce in that way, it's almost impossible to predict carry distance. But if you're seeing it kind of be more of a thud and be like gliding as opposed to wanting to kind of dig down. What are the conditions like in Dubbo? Would you say that bunkers are sort of soft, medium, or firm?
Oh, there's a little bit of variation. Like they are good. I wouldn't say that they're nowhere near as soft as magenta, like because you don't have that beach sand. It's more of a, I think it's like a crushed lime or crushed granite or something along those lines. But it's really really good sand, but it is a little bit more coarse as well. So when they get wet, they do compact a little bit, probably more so than what you would get at a place like Magenta.
Mm-hmm.
But they're generally very good. I'd probably say they were more in the medium scale than the soft. They're definitely not hard. They'd be somewhere in that sort of soft to medium range. But yeah, it's just interesting. Like it's a visible difference in the look of the divot, and it's looks like it's been sort of scraped and compressed a little bit in the bottom of the divot. So I looked at that and I thought, well, that's an unusual one, and it's just happening all the time. So it's clearly the way that the bounce is interacting with the sand, which is different to anything I've seen before.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes having to recalibrate stuff like that is not a bad thing because maybe what you were doing before wasn't great and you just kind of made it work. So yeah, maybe if it's starting to work a little better through the sand, like I said, more of that thud type feel, you can get a little bit more predictable. You might have to shorten your swing or whatever it is to try to figure out how far they kind of go now because it works differently. But yeah, great.
Yeah. So that's one thing which is a bit different. But the other thing, which is the main one, is just I now am not dreading chipping around the greens as I was. It's actually a bit of the fun's come back into the short game, and yeah, it's nice.
Awesome.
It's nice to pull out a club that you feel a bit more confident with, because I think the weight of the club head on the SM10s is so much heavier than what I was using beforehand. So just that sort of pendulum action through the ball, it's a lot more confidence rather than having to really work it through the ball around the green. I feel
I
is probably
do
a good
recall
thing.
you saying that when we were testing, yours v SM10. Yeah, great.
Mm. Mm.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm really looking forward to when the time comes to getting a fitting. I find with my wedges as well, and I don't know if this just comes down to having the wrong bounce and the wrong grind, but hitting full shots with my 58 and 54, I struggle with a little bit. I rarely hit more than a three-quarter 54 or 58. What I have a tendency to do if I've got, say, a full 58, I'll go down to my 54. If I've got a full 54, I'll go down to my 50. Just because I don't have the confidence to be able to hit a full shot with a wedge.
Yeah, it definitely could be grind and bounce. Like it bounce probably is the first thing I would think of there that maybe is the reason why it's not working as well through the turf on full shots. yeah, I guess we'll probably know that answer when we catch up and see what you've got at the moment and potentially what could be different. Um, yeah, difficult one to answer without actually
Yeah.
going through a fitting.
Yeah, and I understand that, and of course both, both the Vokies that I got, I just bought off the rack at a retail store, so there was no the thought process behind it. This was a number of years ago, Steve. So
Before you had
the
the
thought,
epiphany of club fittings, yeah.
yeah, the thought process behind it was I did have a couple of Cleveland wedges which were fairly low bounce, and my short game was pretty poor at that stage, and I'd read that the more bounce you have, the easier it is to chip and pitch. So I went for the S grind and the 12-degree bounce, both 54 and 58 was the same thing. So yeah, it was very much just again just reading some random article that I found on the internet, and then just going out and going, oh yeah, that sounds pretty good. I'll go and buy that.
Yeah, very common, very common. Um, yeah, I mean, I think like the wording of like bounce as your friend as a rule is pretty common. I would say the right bounce is the best option as opposed to more
Mm,
bounce, because sometimes more bounce isn't the answer. So yeah, bounce is definitely your friend. There's a lot of times people turn up and they're trying to make things work that, hey, we can give you something that's just easy to use and you don't have to be as precise. And hey, when you get that one that's a little heavy, like the soul of this grind is designed to work a little faster, whereas this one's designed to be a little bit more precise and for a more skilled player and or firmer turf conditions or whatever it may be. And you can just make life easier by changing the grind. Like
mm,
it can
yeah, yeah.
genuinely work that way. Yeah, but like
Mm.
I said, to know whether or not it is the bounce, it's the problem. Maybe it's the grooves, maybe it's the shaft length, maybe it's the shaft weight. I don't know. We'll get obviously figure that out.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm looking forward to having a further discussion about different bounces for different courses as well. Because as Steve and I are going and playing different courses, and
Mm.
we're going to be playing different courses more on the senior amateur tour. I think that having different bounces, I don't know that the PGA Tour guys, they have different bounces they take with them, and depending on the course setup and what the course is like on that week, or even on that particular day, they'll change the wedge that they've got in the bag. So that'll be an interesting process to go through as well.
Yeah, yeah. They obviously have the luxury of having a tool van with them each week, so they're pretty fortunate in that space. Um, yeah, I think for the call it everyday golfer like you and I think that sometimes the setup of having two different bounces in your sand and lob wedge, or for Steve, it's the 52 and 56. It can be a benefit because it can kind of lean on one of those two. Yeah, the alternative is that, hey, maybe you have a sand wedge and two different lob wedges. Um, because, yeah, you might be playing somewhere that's so different. I mean, if you're playing golf at, say, the Sandbelt in Melbourne one week, and then you're coming back and playing on at the Lakes Golf Club or at Wyong Golf Club, which is where I was the assistant pro at before I was with Titleist. I mean, it's just very different turf. And yeah, if it's going to those types of extremes, and for you guys, if you're going to be playing so many different golf courses, it's probably not a bad one to have that if you're willing to go through that process. Some players are just like, hey, you know what? I just want to keep it simple and play the same thing, and that's fine.
Mm.
But if you're like, hey, you know what? I know that I'm going to be doing playing a lot of different golf courses, then yeah, sometimes that extra wedge can be a good thing. But it's the same sort of thing where you have to test it and see if it works on those conditions.
Mm, mm. Well, even what you just mentioned, the difference between, where you're playing now at Magenta compared to Wyong. I mean, one's Kikuyu and the other one's pretty tightly mown Cooch. I mean, they're very different surfaces.
Very different. Yeah, I mean,
Mm.
like I said, I really don't use my 58 all that often around the greens. I chip a lot with my 54. I find that that's a really good club for me to use greenside. I play with a 10S in that space, and then, like I said, it's a lob wedge. It's man, if it's not 90%, it's really close to that with how often I use it in the bunkers. And if you've played Magenta before,
Yeah.
there is, I don't know how many bunkers on each hole, but there's probably
Lots.
5 or 6.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them. So, and you find them all the time. So for me, that's why I do that. But yeah, definitely Wyong to Magenta, completely different. That's probably a good example to say, hey, that's where you could opt to have 2 different options in a most lofted wedge.
Yeah, I think somewhere like Magenta, you may also want to carry a Texas wedge, just for some of those lies.
Yeah.
I've guilty of using that 1 or 2 times around.
No, not a bad option around Magenta, especially when you get into some of those swales and you've got no green to work with, and you're going up a swale that's almost as tall as what you are.
That's the thing.
Go on, Steve.
I was just saying, it's just about trying to reduce that margin for error. Like what do they say, that the bad chip is always going to be worse than a bad putt.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we're fortunate around there where the surfaces, the runoffs around the greens, they're so firm and compact that it almost rolls like a green. So you can kind of get away with hitting putter, whereas at Wyong into Kike, it's really unpredictable to do that. So chipping off sometimes is a benefit. But yeah, if you're chipping with not enough bounce, it's can be pretty brutal.
Mind you, in saying that, at Magenta, I've found that just hitting it on the wrong side of the flag, you on, say, a course like Wyong, which you might only be sort of 10 or 15 feet to one side or the other of the flag, and it stops there, and you've got a 10 or 15-foot putt. Whereas at Magenta, if you're just that small margin of error and you go down into one of the swales, you could be 30, 40 meters away with this really tough chip, or as what Steve said, the Texas wedge back up. That you've got this big sort of slope that anything short could end up back at your feet again, and you've got exactly the same shot in front of you for your seconds. So there are advantages and disadvantages, I guess, with all of it.
Yeah. I think it's always in fitting and on the golf course. There's always positives and negatives for every situation you go to. So figuring out which ground works best, and figuring out which option works best. I mean, I don't know how many times at Magenta I've said to myself after missing a green, I've been like, bogey's a really good score here. if I can get this down in 3 from missing the green, I've done really well. So
yeah,
it's just trying to make your bad ones better, and definitely in the fitting process, it's trying to figure out, okay, what's going to work in more than one scenario, not just one. And it's a good avenue to go down if you think that way.
Something else that you made me think of when just listening to those stories, it's not necessarily related, so this will go down as one of the worst segues in podcast history. But we talked before about the golf ball that you use and the importance of the golf ball, and sort of the consistency of using the same one all the time and practicing with the same one. Something I thought was really interesting when we were doing the wedge fitting process. Not only is it important to be doing it off turf rather than off the mat, but I was fortunate enough that you just rolled out the bag of Pro V1s to be doing the wedge fitting with. We're not using range balls, and we're not looking at the feel off range balls, but actually using the proper golf balls during that fitting process. And for me, I think that's a real advantage and a real difference of doing the fitting process with someone like yourself versus going to say one of the chain golf stores or something and hitting wedges into a mat with who knows what golf balls that you're using in those situations. So that was quite cool.
I think I mean, Titleist is forever trying to, or we're always trying to find ways, because the reality is some people, they don't have an option of them to get fit indoors, and that's okay, because that's the reality of just some people and what they're, I guess, hold to. So I mean, we have a wedge fitting app, which a lot of the times we're using in the scenario where we don't have the luxury. What we did with you was the gold standard wedge fitting. Pro V1's off turf with a TrackMan. It was
so
great.
Good.
It was great. Yeah. I wish every fitting for me was like that, because that would be amazing. But it's not the reality for what we do. So Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of different ways to be able to still test wedges, whether it be off mats, whether it be indoors, to be able to figure out which grinds. The Vokey wedge fitting app we use for that scenario is really, really good. It's a combination of hundreds of thousands of wedges hit into our wedge fitting app, and then a combination of questions, and then how you deliver the wedge will give us an idea on grinds. A lot of the times we need to further test it, so we do further testing on that. But yeah, man, if you are getting a wedge fitting off turf with Pro V1 golf balls, it's nice.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. It was more than pretty cool. It was really, really cool. I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
Spending an hour in the morning hitting Pro V1s off turf with brand new wedges with a TrackMan monitoring everything that you're doing. Like, come on.
Yeah, it was good. It was. I do recall actually carrying the wedge bag out before you turned up, and I just took a look down the driving range with. It was pretty nice spawning out there at Dubbo. I just got
beautiful. Yeah,
this looks really good. Like this setup looks really good. I want to hit wedges.
We unfortunately didn't film it at all. I'd had grand plans of doing that, but just kind of got carried away, having a lot of fun going through the process, and didn't actually film any content. Which, apologies to the pilgrims, you don't get to see what we were doing, but it was an epic morning. Andy Walker, I think you definitely need to do it. It's time to upgrade that end of your bag, I feel. But although, no, you've got to go and do your irons first, don't you? Far out, you're going to be spending some money in the next.
Yeah, I know. That's what scares me a bit. But no, look, as we sort of get into tournament play a little bit more, and I know that we've got the New South Wales Country Championships coming up, and then sort of March next year we've got our first New South Wales Senior Amateur, which will be a lot of fun. I think that's probably the sort of the time, when we get a bit more sort of serious about our tournament play, that'll be the time to make the switch.
Yeah. Whenever you think the time's right for you, that's great.
Amazing. We're just rocking up to the 1 hour mark, Jace. So I know you're a busy man this week, and we certainly appreciate the time that you've given to come on and talk to the two of us about all things wedges. Is there anything we've missed? Is there something that we didn't cover about this whole wedge fitting process?
You guys have done well. You've asked a bunch of good questions. Yeah. Kind of wasn't sure what I was going to get shot at me, but I feel like, I mean, being able to go through it yourself and then be relaying that sort of experience was good. Blind testing is a really cool way to go through wedge fitting process and understanding what's going to be right for you without being biased towards anything. It's just how you deliver the wedge, what works best. No, I think you've done a really good job. I think if anybody that's listening and has questions, or just wants to, I guess, start the process of what might be the right thing, the Vokey wedge fitting website is a really good place to start. Like I said, Steve, you got the absolute gold star with what we did with you. That is the perfect scenario if anyone wants to be able to test wedges. But if you wanted to get a baseline, then the Vokey website will ask the sort of questions that I would on the fitting tee and give you a starting point anyway for what grinds could be best for you. But no, you guys asked some awesome questions, so I think people listening hopefully got something away from it.
So if someone wanted to get a fitting, Jason, is it the same process as the club fitting? Is it through the Titleist website and you just sort of book in for a fitting, or is there a different process? Is there something where, of course, you mentioned rather than at a driving range or indoors, you're much better off doing it off turf. Do you have specialist wedge fitting days, or is it just part of your club fitting days?
Club fitting days. So we have our wedges at every event. So the same setup I have with Steve is what I'll have at every single fitting day. If you were like, hey, I really want to get fit off turf somewhere with a normal flighting golf ball, the best thing to do would be just to reach out to me personally, which you guys have my email, so happy for you guys to pass that on to anybody, and I can look to try to get people into a venue that would facilitate that. But yeah, other than that, the Titleist website where you just book into fitting days the way that you do with a driver or iron fitting, and there's a icon to request a wedge fitting, and that's exactly how you would do it.
Nice.
No, very good. It was a lot of fun. It's early days in the process of using the new weapons, but I can certainly report that so far so good. And as I was saying to you before we actually press record, I'm very, very nearly hold a 48-degree SM10 from a bit over 100 meters out, even out of the rough, over trees to about 2 inches.
Nice.
I'm gonna say it leaped out, even though I couldn't see it because there were trees in the way. So they're
Very good.
definitely the velocity of these clubs is definitely trending in the right direction. I've got high hopes. So appreciate everything that you did on the morning. Appreciate your help. Appreciate you coming back on the show for the second time, Jace. Hope to have you again soon that you can talk us through Andy's iron fitting and wedge fitting, and then my future putter fitting. And at that point, we're probably going to have to start the process all over again anyway.
No, mate, more than happy to jump on and talk all things fitting. And it sounds like potentially episode 3 could be after Andy's iron fitting, whenever that works out to be.
I feel like it will be. Amazing. Nice work, Jace. Thank you for joining us.
Cool. No stress. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Andy Walker, how good was that to catch up with our good mate Jace?
That was awesome. Look, I'm a little bit blown away actually, just by the level of detail that goes into getting the right wedges. But I also have to say that I'm really, really glad that you took my advice, and I'm going to say it is my advice of focusing on getting your wedges sorted out rather than going down the line of having a putter fitting. Because I just feel as though this could be, we talked about the plateau of frustration. I think maybe this could be the key that just takes you to the next level.
It could. It absolutely could. It's definitely one of the pieces of the puzzle, without a doubt. And as we're talking in the chat with Jason, I've used the new wedges. I think it's on about maybe 5 or 6 rounds, but predominantly 9-hole rounds. I haven't had a lot of opportunity to get out for 18-hole rounds, although I am getting out this Saturday.
Yep.
So I haven't had a huge amount of time to use them and get to know them, but I can absolutely feel the difference. I can feel, probably more than anything, I can feel a confidence shift.
Yeah.
And particularly with short game, like that's just so important.
For
that's
sure.
half the battle right there.
Yeah. So, and as we know, golf, like many things, is a confidence sport, and if you're standing up over a shot, regardless of whether it's a putt, a pitch, or a full shot, if or got a fairly good idea of what's going to happen, when you play that shot, that just gives you so much more confidence. Whereas as we sort of spoke to Jason about, even having worn grooves and the inconsistencies that worn grooves can have on a shot. I mean, you can't build confidence with a club like that, and with an inconsistent ball flight and distance like that. You just can't.
No, you can't. And it was interesting because when we were doing the fitting, and he was explaining that and talking about in particular that when with worn grooves, what you'll see is the ball roll up the face, it'll launch higher with no spin, quite often not go as far. And then when it lands, roll out rather than checking and stopping.
Yep.
And it made me actually go back to a recent round with my old wedges where I had hit a good drive. And I had about probably 45 meters to the green with a big gaping bunker at the front of the green, pin over the bunker. And I hit what I thought was a really crisp, perfectly struck sand wedge that I thought would be on the number.
Yep.
And it did launch high, and it caught the lip of the bunker, and it went into the bunker.
Yeah.
And then interestingly, with no grooves on that club, played the bunker shot. Again, thought pretty good bunker shot, hit the green, wouldn't stop, rolled out and rolled off the back of the green, quite a narrow green. And I ended up making double from a position where I should have been staring a potential birdie in the face. And I
Mm.
think I completely and utterly blame the clubs for that.
You know what they
So
say about a bad tradesman.
yeah. So I think that will, just little things like that you don't necessarily notice at the time. Like you walk off there and you go,
Mm.
"Oh, I'm kicking myself for leaving it in the bunker at the front of the green." Well, did I? Or
Yeah.
kind of did I get Rochambeaued a little by the ball rolling up the face without effective grooves on the club because the club was about 14 years old.
Yeah. Well, I
So,
think, after our conversation with Jason, I definitely think that that potentially could have been the reason why. And yeah, having, well, and I know he mentioned this in our first chat about 6 months back, cleaning your grooves.
mm,
So not only having good quality wedges and having grooves in your club, but also then cleaning them
mm,
after each shot
that's a very
will,
good point. It's a very
yeah,
good
will
point.
definitely make a massive difference to how your the ball reacts off the club and getting that flight that you need and getting it to, the whole one bounce and grip, the
Mm.
spin you were talking about that you've now actually discovered spin.
It's amazing. It's a whole new world. So no, and I do think it's one of those things, and I now you know, I have a lot more confidence around the greens,
Yeah.
pulling a wedge out, and then that leads to a little bit more creativity around the greens as well with trying to do different things because you're not just focused on I want to try and make contact, but it's actually
Yeah.
now I want to try and really think about where I want to land it and I'll the amount of height that you want to put on certain shots
Yeah.
and various things. So it's
Yeah.
I think it was long overdue. Obviously, I'm excited to see where it leads, and hopefully see that strokes gained number move in the right direction for short game.
Yeah, well,
We
it's
shall
going to be
see.
interesting to see how that sort of plays out. Have you actually reset your strokes gained with those
No, I haven't.
clubs?
I actually haven't. I need to. I
That'll be
need
an
to do that. Yeah,
interesting, yeah, thing
yeah.
to do to reset those strokes gained and then just to have a fresh start and fresh numbers from the get go. I think that will definitely be a really good process to understand the difference between where you were and what you've got now. So
Mm,
yeah, what
mm.
one thing to put on the to-do list.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, it's good fun. There's been a few more other things percolating away in the background, Andy Walker, for quite a lot actually for us to talk about in other episodes as well. So I'm not going to give too much away just now,
Mm.
but it's been a bit going on.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. No, there's a lot going on in the playing space. There's a lot going on in the technology space. There's a lot of stuff to talk about.
Mm. Anyway, we'll leave you pilgrims on that little cliffhanger, and you can wonder about what is it? What are they talking about? What more is there?
Mm.
There's a lot more going on, ladies and
Yes, there
gentlemen.
is.
So we will come to that in other episodes. In fact, some of it we may have already talked about in previous episodes. You don't know when you're going to be listening to this. But anyway, Andy Walker, I think that's probably it for us this week. Unless there's anything else that you can think of that we need to do.
Only one thing, that is to
Mm,
rock out, pilgrims.
nice.